Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Davis Museum. So today we're having our Fall 2018 Symposium, and the Davis Discovery Symposium series brings expertise to focus on a single artwork in the Davis's collection and to promote and expose new scholarship and museological practice, cross-disciplinary perspectives, and primary research in the field. Today's event focuses on the work of György Kepes. Although known for his work in a diverse array of creative processes, including film and photography, György Kepes' work also includes oil on canvas, including abstract composition housed in the Davis's collection. So I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us today for the symposium, which also coincides with the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT. So today's presentations will be with Márton Orosz, curator of the collection of photography and media arts at the Museum of Fine Arts in Budapest, and the acting director of the Vasarely Museum, along with Joanna Fink, director of Alpha Gallery, and Theresa Carmichael, arts conservator and owner of Carmichael Art Conservation. We are so pleased that our presenters today are bringing different perspectives to the symposium, and we are grateful to them for providing deeper insight into abstract composition. I'll ask that you save your questions for the end, although with today's format, we'll be starting with Marton, and as he is based in Hungary right now, we will actually have some time after his presentation for some Q&A, and then after that we will also go into the next two presentations and have Q&A with them too at the end. And if you could save your questions for the end of Martin's presentation and also for the end of Theresa and Joanna's presentation, that would be great, where we can engage in dialogue. And I just wanted to thank the generosity of the Wellesley College Friends of Art for supporting this symposium. And then I also wanted to welcome Julie Stone today. She is Kepes' daughter, so it's such an honor that she is joining us today. So I'd like to welcome her up here to do a few remarks. So please join me in welcoming Julie. Thank you. Okay.
So, just looking around to see if any faces I know. A couple, yeah. Thank you, Davis Museum, Arthurine Affairs. Students, are there students here? Good. That's what I was hoping. And assembled symposium attendees for giving me the opportunity to share a few words about my father, György Kepes. I want to specifically thank Theresa Carmichael for the superb job of restoring the painting, abstract composition, and finally to Wellesley College for their continued commitment to the arts. A few anecdotal words about my father, who was a complex man who did not drive a car or ride a bicycle, yet he founded the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT when art was not a high priority for this esteemed engineering and technology institution. My father was able to convince MIT that his visionary ideas to bring scientists and artists together would be transformational and beneficial. Today, MIT is second in the world in the arts and design, according to QS World University Ranking, based in part on this broad interdisciplinary collaboration. He was a man who bridged cultures and changing times, whose books have become basic texts for architects, designers, and students across the multidisciplinary academic and applied arts spectrum. I have fond memories of helping my father in his later years when he was confined to a wheelchair for almost 15 years and needed assistance. He would call out the name of a color, burnt sienna, cadmium red, or Prussian blue. Hand me the brush he wanted the specific color on, and I would go on a scavenger hunt looking for that tube. Hey. I might find it hidden somewhere amidst the tangle of half-used Winsor & Newton oil paints, rabbit's foot glue, and Wellfleet beach sand. His summers were spent with the family on Cape Cod painting and writing, surrounded by nature. He would work in his studio in the woods overlooking the pond for hours while my mother was also busy creating her children's books or immersed making ink drawings of imaginary birds and creatures. At the sound of the ringing of our cowbell, the family gathered for lunch at the low table perched above the pond on the screened-in porch of our house on stilts, designed by the architect Marcel Breuer, a close friend and fellow Hungarian. My parents usually worked until late afternoon when we often had guests come over and swim, or play ping pong, or for ping pong matches, badminton, or chess games, and as was the custom then, a glass of sherry at sunset. The book by Peter McMahon and Christine Cipriani, Cape Cod Modern, Mid-Century Architecture and Community on the Outer Cape, is a great account of those times in that community. A sign painted on a piece of plywood siding nailed to a tree at the entrance of our small dirt road read Kepes, working weekdays, visitors please come after 4:30. I still have that sign because as a child I did not like having to wait for my friends to visit until late afternoon. We did not have a car until I turned 16. My mother and I learned to drive at the same time. Nor did my father choose to have a TV until he may have been in his 80s. The lifestyle on the Cape was very rustic. For years we had an icebox, no electricity or phone. We walked everywhere and had only a hand pump for water and kerosene lamps for light in the evenings. For my father, it was reminiscent of his childhood. This simplicity was a counterbalance to his life in Cambridge and beyond. For me, his paintings reflect this inner sanctity and balance. There are so many memories I could share, but I will leave you with a recent one. Paul Weidlinger, the structural engineer who during the war found himself in Paris basically volunteering for Le Corbusier, was a childhood friend of my father's. They corresponded regularly in the late 30s and during the war, and in the late 30s and 40s during the war, a traumatic time for both of them. One of the letters I had translated was surprising. He wrote to Paul describing this new concentration away from oil painting to making photograms. He said it was a necessity because he could not afford to buy the paint. He resumed his oil painting when he came to MIT in the late 40s with a modest studio in a room of our three-family house, permeating the air with turpentine. The smell I love to this day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. So now I'd love to introduce to you Márton Orosz, who is the curator of the collection of photography and media arts at the Museum of Fine Arts, the Hungarian National Gallery in Budapest, where he's also the director of the Vasarely Museum, affiliated to the same institution. He earned his PhD in art history in Budapest, and during his studies he was Terra Fellow at Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., a György Kepes Fellow for Advanced Studies and Transdisciplinary Research at MIT, a Forum Transregional Studien Institute for Cultural Inquiry Postdoctoral Fellow in Berlin, a Center for Contemporary Art Curator in Residence in Singapore, and a Getty Research Institute grantee in Los Angeles. He has lectured widely, both across Europe, the US, and Asia. His publication ranges fields from photography, avant-garde collectorship, concrete and kinetic art, to motion picture. And needless to say, he is one of the preeminent, if not the most preeminent researcher on Kepes' work. So it is such an honor for him to join us today. So with that, please join me in welcoming Márton.
Thank you very much. So, the Hungarian-born painter, photographer, designer, theoretician, and impresario György Kepes was not just a shapeshifter of modernism, but a visionary polymath, a Renaissance man, a homo universalis, whose knowledge and expertise run across many fields and disciplines. His mission as an artist and thinker relied on the education of the Bauhaus with the aim to establish a new form of public art that is based on the holistic integration of art, science, and technology. Kepes's enterprise, which he termed interthinking and interseeing, was an important historical precursor to and reference point for the study of contemporary phenomena. It can be regarded as a forerunner of various types of community-based art, the changing character of authorship in the post-war global art world, up until to such paradigms as visual culture, new media art, or science and technology studies. When Kepes arrived to Cambridge on 1st March 1946, he not only brought fine art to MIT, but shortly after his appointment, he established the MIT Society of Liberal Arts, the first community to discuss modern art there. As we all know, in 1967, he founded the Center for Advanced Visual Studies, which at the time of his creation, the only institution of its, which was at the time of his creation, the only institution of its kind in the world, an academic hub for art science interactions. György Kepes was born in North Hungary in 1906, educated as a painter at the Hungarian Academy of Fine Arts, and became a second-generation avant-garde artist in his native country. Due to the repressive political and economic situation in the 30s, he emigrated to Berlin, Germany, and started to collaborate with his fellow countryman, László Moholy-Nagy. Their association continued in London in 1935, where they moved to due to the Nazi takeover. In the fall of 1937, on the invitation of Moholy, Kepes was appointed to a professor of drawing and photography at the New Bauhaus and subsequently at the School of Design in Chicago, where he rethought the visual aesthetics of the cameraless photography. After his falling out with Moholy, he left Chicago and finished his first and probably most seminal book, The Language of Vision, in 1944 in Denton, Texas, that was translated to more than 10 languages. Having invited to the Brooklyn College, New York in the same year, he started to teach visual fundamentals to such students as Saul Bass or Beverly Pepper. In 1945, he was invited to the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT as a professor in visual design, which position he kept until his retirement in 1972. MIT made him to be interested in finding links between the two cultures, as C.P. Snow defined it not too much later. As early as 1951, he organized the pioneering The New Landscape exhibition at the Hayden Gallery at MIT, a peculiar setting of abstract micro and macrographic images that run parallel with the cybernetic discourse that has been developed by natural scientists in the same period. Simultaneously, Kepes started to organize interdisciplinary seminars, and the materials of these interdisciplinary gatherings served as a basis for the 7 volumes Kepes edited during the mid-60s, titled Vision and Value, being still a fundamental source book of the era. From the wide-ranging output Kepes practiced as a visual artist, painting is the less known and to a certain degree and still an untouched area, despite the fact that he was always regarded himself as a painter. Quote, "I have painted since I can remember," unquote, admitted Kepes in one of the interviews. He was regarded as a prodigy child as a teenager. His earliest works we know of are fresh in color. They reveal a virtuoso drawing ability, a realistic but stylized rendering of the chosen subject. The rigor of his compositions are mitigated by hazy and misty execution of the surfaces. Kepes studied at the same Lutheran high school in Budapest, where a few years earlier, the becoming members of the Manhattan Project received their degrees. The Nobel Prize winner Eugen Wigner, whose theorem considered to be the cornerstone in the mathematical formulation of quantum mechanics, and John von Neumann, who developed the concept of computing and game theory. They not only shared the same teacher in physics and mathematics, but in the drawing and art history class as well. One of Kepes' schoolmates was a young poet who published his first book with a surrealist content titled Túlavaló, in English, Beyond the Real, in 1928, and asked Kepes to illustrate it. These figurative ink drawings are recalling the style of the Austrian expressionist painter Oskar Kokoschka and the physiognomy of the characters in his lyrical works of the Austrian-based painter. The opposing the light-shadow effect, the sharp contrast and chiaroscuro of the contrasted black and white images, conjuring up the aesthetic style of the members of the German expressionist group Die Brücke, especially the prints of Emil Norde. In fact, the first portrait pictures that we know from Kepes are produced in the post-impressionist fashion. However, they loosely follow the style of expressionism in their execution. As the conservative Beaux-Arts type Academy of Fine Arts in Budapest, where Kepes enrolled in 1924, he studied with István Csók, who was described as the Hungarian Pierre Bonnard. Although Csók's visual aesthetics was somewhat outdated in the second decade of the 20th century, he was liberal in the sense that he let his students work freely and honored their openness and candor. Visual sources of contemporaneous avant-garde art were either missing or limited to some reproductions in Hungary those years. In Kepes, with his fellow students, were conducting experiments to imitate the visual characteristic of the most recent isms, among others, Cubism, Surrealism, and Constructivism. They formed a group called Progressive Youth, and took part in exhibitions in some prominent museums and galleries in Budapest. By expressing a social political message and pairing their subject matter with a highly provocative Dadaist-like photo collage or assemblage technique, by literally gluing pieces of photographs in their constructive abstract paintings that had a tactile, relief-like, almost sculptural quality, they were put in the limelight of the critic. Kepes, for example, to make his case of his Marxist political views, used an image of a corpse of the anti-war activist and revolutionary socialist woman martyr Rosa Luxemburg, who was sentenced to death in 1919 by the German authorities. The martyr's disfigured corpse, based on the torn-out newspaper photograph, juxtaposed with a nude figure above, and the composition was framed in a constructivist setting where a machine part answered to the disembodied head, and the whole structure was set against a heavily textured, earth-colored background. This work, along with all others, triggered a nationwide scandal, and the Hungarian Ministry of Culture blocked the future career of Kepes and his fellows by causing their studies unfinished at the university and forcing their professor István Csók to an early retirement. It was Lajos Kasták, the prophet of the Hungarian avant-garde movement, the leader of the so-called activist group, through whom Kepes started to systematically seek to the appropriate medium, artistically coping with the social injustices and the inhuman conditions of his country's society. As an answer to these hopeless problems, he did many caricatures in the turn of the 20s and the 30s that conveyed a strong political message. Kepes was convinced that filmmaking, compared to painting, is a rather anemic tool of human expression to render the social values, the social conscience, and to satisfy the needs of the visual sensibilities of the artist. Although filmmaking proved to be a costly medium to exercise, Kepes abandoned painting for almost 1.5 decades long and switched to photography and graphic design after settling down in Berlin in 1930 for working with Moholy-Nagy. Quote, "Photography was a temporary bridge between my world and then the new territory of film. Photography is capable of revealing elements of morphology, which it would take a lot of time to discover through painting, explained Kepes, justifying his choice. What is important to stress out, however, is the fact that his interest in producing art with paint has never been ceased. When he taught photography as the head of the light and color workshop at the New Bauhaus in Chicago, he experimented with processes that he evocatively termed as photo drawing and photo painting. Kepes was particularly interested in the combination of two techniques already in use in the 19th century, the cliché wear and decalcomania, to allow materials of differing viscosity to mix. The lava-like formation of blurring ink and colored pigments between the glass sheets before the photographic paper induced physical processes that could be looked upon as metaphysical events. The photograms, which, thanks to their autopoiesis, represent the absolute peculiarity of the photographic processes, are unique and irreproducible works that cannot be imitated, and their peculiar stylistic marks cannot be abstracted and learned. Kepes has a small number of paintings he produced during the Second World War. One of them was included to the 1943-44 touring exhibition, Abstract and Surrealist Art in America, organized by Sidney Janis. The painting, Aerial Photography China, alluded to a battle of Chansai, and a large portion of a photograph applied to the left side, an aerial view of the city connected to the camouflage teaching and the dazzle exercises and mimicry experiments Kepes and his students were conducting at the time at the School of Design in Chicago. The contradiction of the two-dimensionality of the photograph and the tactile, sensitive character of the painted parts with the impasto technique, combined with the grits and sand glued into the surface, directly associated to the sensory trainings conducted at Kepes and other professors' class, such as the students' explorations in the property of wood paper, sculpture exercises, and even working with tactile charts with which the students tested the blind people invited to the school for that occasion. Another iconic painting from the period is the war piece, Mother, that could be interpreted as some other symbolic image of the disaster, and it was emotionally charged with associative meaning by combining the baffling rough imagery of the bullet-holding belt of a soldier, represented by a torn photograph, and the face of a harrowed woman, evoking the ballads of the medieval French poet François Villon. The rigid character of the woman face contrasts with the white pigeon, the symbol of freedom, as well as the spontaneity of the fluid drips of the paint consisting of vertical lines in the lower part of the picture. In other words, the interplay of the many distinctive parts of the composition add up to the whole. Here, like in other works by Kepes, the interpretation takes place in three levels: in the sensuous, in the symbolic, and in the emotional. The artist's own teaching at the school that was focusing on the plastic organization, the visual representation, and the power of the composition of elements, such as the arrangements of lines and the colors, were also evident in his paintings produced in the 40s. The need of balance and the careful compositional adjustments that were evident in his photographs also occurred in his small-size gouache paintings. By juxtaposing and interlocking the two complementary words in them, the abstract organic character of the vibrant paint from the one hand, and the concrete man-made mathematical form of a geometric object in the other. The dark brown earth-bound colors were still predominant in his paintings even after the war was over and he started to teach at MIT. This was the time he set off to paint again with a greater passion, and that has to do with the fact that he obtained a land in Wellfleet at Cape Cod, where he got to build a cottage by his architect friend and countryman Marcel Breuer that served him as a summer studio. The landscapes Kepes started to paint around that time can be regarded as an abstract representation of the vegetation in the Cape that was combined with an inner landscape and imagined world of the artist. What is important to stress out, though, is that his paintings never represented the reality of the nature per se, but he constructed the materiality of the environment with tactile means on the canvas. In 1953, Kepes was quoted in the catalogue of the Midwestern Biennial Exhibition. Quote, "In the last 15 years, I have painted very little, altogether not more than 6 months." Unquote. This tendency, however, was drastically changed in the end of the decade. In the early 50s, his style was the most close to the painters of the New York School and the abstract expressionists, but they still contained some elements from his surrealist and his Dadaist period. The turn in Kepes' artistic career happened simultaneously with his new assignment as a professor at MIT and his direct confrontation with the realms of science and technology. While there, Kepes found much inspiration in the imagery of science and technology. This new element that enriched his work is very evident in his painting, Cosmic Ray Christmas from 1950, just a year before the new landscape show at MIT. The picture shows a tiny scientific photograph of a cosmic shower in the lower part of the composition that visually conjures up the Christmas tree as the main subject of the work. The scientific photograph was a direct reference of Kepes' friend, MIT professor in experimental physics, Bruno Rossi's research on cosmic radiation. As the painter explained, he sought to lift the veil on his beautiful hidden rhythm of the world. In fact, Kepes' artistic style as a painter couldn't be easily classified. He termed the style of his own painting as romantic expressionism, whatever this definition means. The free movement of his brush and the splotches of planes that spontaneously hit the surface, producing energetically laid marks in his animal panels that Kepes painted for the Free Library here in Vasarely. It's very close to the drippings of Jackson Pollock, and some of them were even comparable with the dynamic balance between restrained and ordered gestural brush strokes in Robert Motherwell and Franz Klein's painting, while Kepes' other facade designs, such as the one in the library building of Fitchburg, Massachusetts, conjured up the visual characteristic of Klein's stills, solemn rendering of large expanses. These works were, in certain sense, in accordance with the formalist doctrines of the Greenbergian modernism, as the paint being a medium was equivalent of itself. They visually invoked the gestural emotions of the artist's will, thus they were absolutely free from the metaphors and symbolic overtone that was evident in other paintings by Kepes. The lyrical character of his generally somber canvases and their homogeneous, dark, dreary, brownish tonal quality was similar to the contemporaneous Italian arte povera painter Alberto Burri's technique, applying and combining unusual materials to his canvases, like wood, burnt plastic, or iron bars. Burri started to produce his lenient and sack-close compositions in the early 50s, evoking an analogous visual appearance than Kepes' canvases, even though Burri's use of paint of them was limited, but he also added pumice and sand. However, the bonding material was shellac and not casein, like in Kepes' case. Although in many of Kepes' paintings the dominating color was brown, it was always elucidated with another by rectifying its all-embracing power with a contrasting, complementary one, most often a glowing mark. Fire glimmers in lyric spots in Kepes' canvases and bursts in volcanic hot red, visually alluding to the molten metal, the fiery matter, or in other settings conjuring up the onboard stars, the shadows of the heaven. The many hues of the soil, the sand, the grits, the cracks of dry ground of the earth could be associated to his childhood as he grew up in the countryside of Hungary, where his father served as a manager of the estate and the landed property of an aristocratic noble family. The symbolic connection to the Mother Earth in Kepes's case was also connected to the Anthos legend he frequently cited in his lectures. As we know, in the Greek mythology, Anthos would challenge all passerby to wrestling matches and remain invincible as long as he remained in contact with his mother, the goddess Gaia, the personification of Earth. His 1951 painting, Hand and Bread, was still semi-representational, and the symbolic meaning of the earth was even emphasized by a photograph of a bread that was added to it as a form of assemblage. If we would compare Kepes's paintings based on a formal analysis, we could define many groups which possess a recurrent use of a single formal theme. The orchard or the garden was a recurring subject in his paintings. Garden represented the symbolic systemless richness of the word, the organic vibration of color interaction, and the artists elucidated. By representing the garden, he often referred to it in their title as a medieval closed garden, the so-called hortus conclusus in Latin. With earth and bronze, he mixed into the paint together with sand and casain as a rustic additive. He applied the pigment in several layers with a spatula and his bare hands. The light that permeates the texture of his painting simultaneously recalls real lands and those existing only in memory. The garden as a subject also indicated a formative experience. Kepes's encounter with the Swiss painter Paul Klee in 1935 changed his entire attitude to art and inspired him to resume painting. When Kepes visited Klee in his Bern studio in Switzerland, there were a great number of finished and unfinished paintings sitting on the floor. What did really struck Kepes was that Klee introduced himself to him as a gardener and not as a painter. He considered himself a gardener who carefully waters his precious plants, figuratively his paintings, with the appropriate quantity of colors every day. What is really fascinating in this context that Kepes, in his mature years, in fact, regarded his paintings as living entities. When in 2009 I visited the Fenway in Boston, where Kepes used to have a studio at the second floor, and I met a restorer who still remembered Kepes, and in fact, she had some discussions with him about the fragile texture, the delicate elements that are an integral part of his work, and about the very notion that canvases won't necessarily outlast the artist. As the story goes, the restorer woman once asked Kepes what would happen with his pictures when he won't be there anymore. Kepes' answer was as follows, quote, "My paintings have to learn how they can take care of themselves and to teach others after I'm gone." I think this is a statement that tells how close his paintings were to his soul and why he would never finish a work that easily. In fact, the photographs taken in his studio also suggest that he was working simultaneously on many of his works. For that matter, the subjects of garden reoccurred in many periods of the artist's body of work. Kepes's mission to promote the special extension of vision was already present in his museum's Oasis project that was published by the Interior magazine in 1950. This environment-centered conceptual installation could be pertinently described as the garden of vision, as Kepes attempted to shift the art museum containing artifacts made by humans into the domain of a museum of natural science. Quote, "Our museums have to some faults have the same faults as most other places where city people go. They are big, overwhelming, man-made deserts where the foot grows sure, the eye weary, the mind numb, opined Kepes. The impact of artifacts hanging on the wall or dispersed in space would have been enhanced by live plants, twisted roots on the ground, colorful marble blocks, grained stumps, spirally curling snail shells, birds twittering in cone-shaped cages, and fish swimming in pools in order to take advantage of the continuously changing visual effects created by the interaction of air, water, and sunshine. If the plan had been realized, the new community space imagined by Kepes would have provided much-needed refreshment and relief for museum goers, exhausted by the enjoyment of artifacts demanding a significant exertion of their respective perceptive organs. The visual and symbolic counterpart of the garden was the city, produced in 1949-1950, known in the collection of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Kepes explained that the city is like a man-made garden, where we can also find plants, and the houses are like flowers in the garden, having their own history and own recollections. The city from above is one of the most frequent, most important, and probably most favorite theme in Kepes' body of work. When he designed some posters, leaflets, and brochures in the mid-30s for the Imperial Airways, the predecessor of the British Airways, he was awarded to get an airplane ticket that made him able to fly from London to Paris. As a young artist, this experience was critical for his fascination for the aerial view of the nightscape of the city. When he conducted camouflage experiments in the Second World War in Chicago, he had to take helicopter flights in order to compare the visual effects of the light and shadow areas viewed from the air tested on the city in different areas of the day. These experiments made such a great impact to his compositional formulas that he not even incorporated the atmospheric view of the city in his paintings, but the idea also came into fruition in his public works, most notably in the programmed kinetic light mural he did for the KLM Dutch Airline Company's New York ticket office in 1959. As being an animated principle, light was a central theme in Kepes' paintings too. As being an light, as Kepes once put it, the lost Eden of the eye, mystically represented the dualism between light and darkness, a complementary dialogue between the two primary forces. Kepes' paintings are easily recognizable. They bear a definite identity. We can classify them based on the underlying motifs, typically a geometrical form, providing a hidden inner structure and layers of abstract forms, being a reminiscence of natural processes, contouring up the phenomena of an organic growth. The overlapping structures that unfold from each other can be easily studied in Kepes' notebooks, where he usually sketches out the concept of his paintings in advance. They could be regarded as a calculated interplay between the chaos and order, or according to the definition of the Harvard professor, the Gestalt psychologist Rudolf Arnheim, they represent, quote, defined elusiveness. We can follow how the artist produced the painting documented by the photographer B.L. Kalman. By looking at these pictures, we can conclude that the first stratum was indeed a geometric pattern, a perfect form that was step by step clouded over, eaten into, rusted away. This peculiar duality was also expressed in the titles of the paintings, which almost always consisted of two words that were alluding to that theme of the paintings, however embrace the strange, sometimes even contradictory relationship to each other. Giving titles to his works seemed to be a great joy to the artist. Some of the titles I just selected for you randomly are Doubt, Psalm, Crossword, Panic, Hideous Certainty, Indefinite Identity, Arrogant Apology, Consoled Moment, etc. In the post-war period, there were not a single painting by Kepes that would express a social political content or a given narrative. One exception was a work that used to be hung in the Harvard Divinity School. The one here is not the same I will talking about, since it is considered to be lost or it's in an unknown place, but a similar one in its composition. That painting was visually evoking the picture of an age-old tree trunk by reflecting on a moment of a civil rights movement of the 60s. In May 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, Ku Klux Klan members bombed a Baptist church on a Sunday morning and killed 4 young girls. The colors of the painting did correspond to the dreadful event, and the pressing down technique in the middle of the composition, produced with a glue painted over a red scar, symbolically alluded to the act of the massacre. The Birmingham painting, with its explicit content, was a powerful work, much different than those which were evoking a peaceful lyricism. Kepes' canvases expressed pools of stillness, areas of entrancement, quote unquote, as the British art historian Herbert Reed put it in his introductory essay published in the occasion of Kepes' 1954 exhibition catalogue at the Institute of Contemporary Art, ICA, in Boston. Lynchon greens, plum browns, and smoky blacks were all visible in various settings and arrangements, either expressing an intimate subdued contemplative behavior of the shades, like in his paintings that were comparable with canvases that are represented by the Singaporean modernism, a group of Southeast Asian artists, especially Anthony Poon or Cheong So Pieng, members of the so-called Alpha group, who were indirectly influenced by Kepes through Anton Ehrenzweig's Gestalt theory, which based on, quote, the undifferentiated matrix of artistic imagination, unquote. Some other types of Kepes' paintings express the chromatic richness of colors comparable with the works of the abstract expressionist painter Hans Hofmann, who Kepes highly regarded in his late years. This richness of the colors was also evident in Kepes' mosaic decorations and stained glass windows designs he produced in the 60s to various churches, schools, hotels, and libraries across the United States. Just a few examples here. One of his mosaic decoration design from Dallas, one of the most emblematic one from San Francisco, the one he produced in '84, and it will be restored in the next couple of years at the Harvard Square in Cambridge, or Sheraton Hotel mosaic decoration at a lobby in Philadelphia, or Jewish church in Baltimore. Kepes' work at the Davis, which is the subject of this symposium, is a very special piece that connects the artist's experiments with the mosaic pattern, his research on the contrasting power and the evocative character of the colors, and could be placed in the tendency of his search for a rigid, structured, almost mathematical form that he was seeking to collide with the lyrical, abstract, gestural expression. In this case, the tiny color dots of the tessellated surface is paired with those large, relief-like amorphous blotches, providing the canvas two interlocking energy fields that complement each other. Depending on the relationship of the two systems, one appears to be either protruding or sunken, but they are relying on each other to add up the whole. The painting at the Davis is comparable with a decade later patchwork picture now at the Camper Art Museum. And the color matrix Kepes produced for the 100 years of anniversary of the MIT in 1961. And the hieroglyphic-like scribbles or marks had some connections to his shorthand icon, now in the collection of the Smith College, that consisted of a homogeneous rectangle attached to a set of block-like fields that possessed a very sensuous, three-dimensional quality, like a moss on a tree trunk, inviting all our senses to get a step closer. In fact, tactility, as I referred to it earlier, played a key role in his works executed by using traditional media. Kepes was always interested in bringing art closer to blind people and the visually impaired. In 1972, with the help of some CAVS fellows, he organized a dialogue for the Senses exhibition in the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut. The museum, considered to be the oldest public museum in the United States, hosted the Tactile Gallery, established at the initiative of D. Sgt. Pepper. The exhibition displayed the works of Paul Earls, Frederick St. Florian, Micho Ihara, along with the curator Mary Lane Ray. The sound installation and texture revolves led to the formation of the multimedia interaction. A year later, Kepes' painting started to focus on the contrasting of optic and haptic elements. Following the dialogue for the Senses show, he received a letter from a blind man inquiring when he would create a rainbow for the blind people. Kepes' paintings start from the rainbow, and the Braille rainbow were created by the use of many layers of paint, while the tactile landscape was achieved by matching the spatial arch of the rainbow with the raised points of the Braille writing. So the Braille writing was also used in the 20 by 24-inch series made with a Polaroid camera in 1984 that was set up at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. On one of the pieces of the Polaroid series arranged around the dialectics of conscious and accidental. The spontaneity of inkblots was contrasted with the systemized points of Braille writing by the strict lines of the grid and perfect form of a crystal incorporating facets were opposed by the two dice and the crossword puzzle illustrating randomness. What makes Kepes an independent and quite unique artist in his day is his reservation against the gallery world. He was represented by many galleries throughout his life, in the early 40s in Chicago by Catherine Koo, who first represented European avant-garde art in the Midwest, and Kepes even had one important gallerist in New York, the Seidenberg, in the early 60s, before being represented by galleries in Boston. I think Joanna Fink, the director of the Alpha Gallery, will tell you more details about this project later, about this subject later. Nevertheless, it is interesting to see in his correspondence and even in his published articles that Kepes tried to keep a distance from the manipulative attitude of the New York art world. His leftist ideology and commitment to the ethical dimension of art made him to believe that artworks not only belonged in art museums and galleries, but were also needed in every single segment of urban life. As a matter of fact, he was a man of duality, not just in the sense of choosing a method to build up his compositions from opposing elements, but also in differentiating two artistic realms within his own work, the private as well as the public art. Painting, he asserted, and I'm quoting him again, is a self-exploration for me, almost a private business, unquote. Kepes never wanted to become a slave to the art market and always strove to ensure that his works would be available and affordable to all. In accordance with this vision, he chose his prices of his works. when he had his first major exhibition from his paintings in 1951 at the Courier Art Gallery in Hanover, New Hampshire, he wrote a letter to the director, and I'm quoting him here again. My prices are flexible, and they depend upon who buys them. For collectors who have money, the price would be $300 to $400. If someone has little money, the minimum is $200, unquote. The fact that he had a secure position at MIT, at least after 1956, when he received his US citizenship, he was not in the need to be instructed and influenced by the gallery world, and could express his ideas independently by developing a style of its own. As Dorothy Adlow framed it by writing about Kepes in the Christian Science Monitor in 1960, and I want to end my presentation with her quote. György Kepes does not engage in the muscular acrobatics and explosive colors, the ego-dominated exercises of some of his contemporaries. He chooses to paint moments of tranquility, of subdued mood, when the atmosphere is shadowy and the light dull. Unquote, and thank you very much for listening.
All right, well, thank you so much, Marton. That was fantastic. And we have actually a few moments to take advantage of Marton's time. So if anyone has any questions, we have a few moments where we can really utilize Marton's expertise. So are there any questions right now?
Okay. Sorry. Did Mr. Kepes tend to ever sign his works? I've worked on a couple of them and have not yet seen a signature. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Did he want his works to be known that they were by him, or did he just want to keep a low profile? I don't know. Thank you.
I'm not really understood your question because it was not loud enough, but I assume that you asked about signing his works, yeah. Right?
Right, that's correct.
Actually, he always signed his works on the back. So he put the dates, his signature, and the title of his works on the back. He never signed his works on the front. I've never ever seen any paintings by Kepes which have been signed on the front. I think it was his way to produce artworks. He didn't want to disturb the fact of his composition by signing them on the front. Maybe that would be the explanation for that. But I've never came across with any written source by the artist about this issue.
All right, great, thank you. I have another question here.
Sia Marton, Silvia.
Hi, Silvia. How are you?
Sia, good. It's good to see you. I have been enjoying reading about and learning about Robert Capa, the famous war photographer, the Hungarian war photographer, and I had read somewhere that György was the first person to give him a camera. Do you know anything more about their relationship? Because you talked about his love of photography. Can you expand on Capa? Because he's really quite popular right now with his Omaha Beach photographs and all of that. Right.
So actually, Kepes and Capa knew each other already from Budapest, and end of the 20s. He became very close friends, and Capa actually settled down to Berlin in 1931 because of, or due to Kepes' invitation. they have some common friends in Berlin, so that was so they formed actually a group of artists. They or not just artists, actually. They was like a scientist of metallurgy as well. Kepes became interested in science through the images he delivered to him and to Capa. And there was another photographer, Eva Besnye, who has now a fantastic exhibition in Cologne in Germany. And in fact, Kepes did many advertisement designs in Berlin, and he earned some money from doing that. And because Capa was very poor at that time, and Kepes tried to help him in many ways. And he, from one of these commissions, from this money he received from one of these commissions, he purchased a camera for Capa. It was a Voigtlander type of camera. I think I don't remember for it was not the Leica format. It was like 6x6 inch format camera, and that was the first camera Capa learned photography with, and his first important photographs he was taken was by this camera. And then later on in the 40s, when Capa just visited the Kepes in their apartment at the Cape in Wellfleet, they did a remarkable picture from each other. So we have a photograph actually at the collection of the Kepes Museum by Capa. It's a photograph documenting the Juliet and György Kepes, and we have also a photograph by Kepes on Capa. So it was like kind of a mutual thing to just taking pictures of each other. So they were really good friends. And Cornel Capa, who was the younger brother of Robert Capa, because as you all know, Robert Capa died very early during the war in Indochina. I think it was in the early 50s or like mid 50s. But Cornel Capa, who established the ICP in New York, which is one of the most important museum for photography in the world, and Cornel Capa also relied on Kepes' expertise when he established in the 80s that center for photography. So the Capa family and the Kepes family is indeed very close to each other in many regards.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Marton. It was such a pleasure having you here with us today. Thank you again so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. And I wish you every success with it and to be followed. And I wish you an enjoyable discussion on campus. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, and then with that, I would love to introduce to you our next speaker. So Joanna Fink is the director of the Alpha Gallery in Boston, where she exhibits the work of emerging and established living artists and several artist estates, including the estate of György Kepes. She's also served as president of the Boston Art Dealers Association since 2009, and she is the curator of the exhibition Modernism and Its Legacy, currently on view at Southern New Hampshire University. So with that, please join me in welcoming Joanna. Thank you.
I will start with talking about Kepes in the context of the Boston art world, because there was a very symbiotic relationship there, starting, right when he came to MIT in 1946. Of course, he had a reputation already when he arrived in the Boston-Cambridge area, but he wasn't really well known as a painter at that time because he had recently started painting again. Oops. But very quickly, he gained recognition in our area. As Martin mentioned, he had a solo exhibition at the Courier Museum in New Hampshire in 1951. And then in 1953, he had an exhibition at the De Cordova Museum. And he had also started showing with a gallery in Boston, the Margaret Brown Gallery on Newbury Street. He exhibited with her until she died in 1957. And then subsequently, he was represented by the Hyman Swetsoff Gallery until his death in 1968. Here is a picture, an undated picture of Hyman Swetsoff in his gallery. And I should mention that we have his son David here in the audience. So maybe he'll have something to say afterwards. Then subsequently, he was represented by my father, Alan Fink, who founded the Alpha Gallery in 1967. Here is an early photograph of Alpha Gallery with my father way in the back. And I love the ashtrays on the bench there too. That certainly dates this photo. So he had his first, Kepes had his first exhibition at Alpha in 1970. I joined the gallery in the later 1980s, and I had the pleasure of working with György until his death in 2001. And of course, now I have the pleasure of working with Julie and the rest of the Kepes family. Now, you've already seen this picture. Again, this is at the Center for Advanced Visual Studies, which was sort of the culmination of a lot of his theoretical thinking and artistic practice. It was a wonderful, I don't know, a think tank, I guess you could say, for artists and scientists to come together and think creatively. And I love this photo. It's obviously posed. And he's surrounded by all this lighting equipment, and he's literally embracing technology. So this picture was taken on the occasion of Kepes, along with another important Boston artist, Maud Morgan, on the occasion of their receiving the first Cambridge Arts Council Awards for Achievement in the Arts. This was in 1987. And I'm just showing this to illustrate again how he really became deeply involved in the Boston and Cambridge art communities. So who were his early collectors? It's an interesting question because, while he had recognition and people knew his name, he was more known for his endeavors in other mediums. So, I mean, it wasn't entirely starting from scratch, but in terms of building a reputation as a painter, working in a new medium, in a new city, it was a little bit like, breaking new ground. But Boston was, a small art community, but it was very sophisticated and very receptive to painting. The Boston Expressionist School was burgeoning in the 1940s. There were numerous galleries in Boston who were exhibiting both local and international contemporary art, and most of them were concentrated on a few blocks of Newbury Street. And in that time, in the early years, even the Institute of Contemporary Art was located on Newbury Street. He was greatly admired and collected among, obviously, the circles of MIT and Harvard, but he was broadly embraced, and that is evidenced by, I had a lot of fun doing this, going through some of the old reviews of his exhibitions, and frequently words like famous and renowned and master would be used to describe Kepes. And it's also kind of interesting to note that many of his collectors have been architects, designers, and urban planners, and it's clearly because of his influence in those disciplines. I've actually had conversations with collectors who cited Kepes's writing and teaching as reasons for wanting to own his paintings. And while there are numerous new collectors whose interest in Kepes is not directly linked to that kind of experience, there still remains a strong connective tissue with Kepes himself for many of his former students. So now you've been looking at this image for a long time, and the title of this painting is Image, and it's from 1961. So this places it around the time that he would have been exhibiting at the Sweatsock Gallery. And I think Marton has said a lot about the evolution of his painting. I like to think of this one as, structured improvisation. And it's got everything, many of his qualities, the contrast of the thickly applied paint, the impasto, the application of sand, the hint of geometry, but also that organic sort of energy and flow of paint. And I'll move on. So this is Smoldering Ciphers from a couple of years later, 1963. And one thing that I really love about Kepes's work is his light. I think he was always thinking about light and, in this case, an inner light. I think Marton also referred a little bit to that. This is actually a quite large painting, but it's this kind of controlled burn, which is very, I think it has a very emotional element to it, as well as just a drama. A couple of years later, this is Silver Dew Ciphers from 1965. And I love the use of the word ciphers in his titles, were sometimes really poetic and beautiful. And in this case, I think he's really thinking about cipher, the sort of the mystery of it, the secret writing, some sort of code maybe. And it's a little hard to see, and that is intentional because it's not clearly articulated in the painting itself, but down at the very bottom of the canvas, is this little suggestion of writing. And it's a tease because it doesn't really say anything. But I think that Kepes was also involved with, mysteries, hidden things, hidden words, hidden images, and that comes up again later. So this is a glow structure from 1971. This dates from around the time that he began exhibiting at Alpha Gallery. Again, there's this wonderful sense of inner light in the painting. And sort of, again, a typical example of how he structured his paintings. And actually, as a little aside, I wanted to say something about his sort of vocabulary, which spanned across disciplines. And as an example of that, I'll show side by side mist structure. And then on the right is a photograph. It's undated, but early, late 30s, I would imagine. Julia's nodding in agreement. But it's so interesting to see how he thought about structuring his picture plane across mediums, even though, talking about different things, but there's that vocabulary. Another example, so this is blue and black from, I think it's from 1961. And on the right is a photogram called Graphic Acrobat, and that's from 1972. So they're pretty far apart in chronology, but again, working with some very similar ways of making marks, the swirl, the V, which is inverted in the painting, and then that splash I'm just going to call it light. So another example of an image sort of crossing over mediums is bread. So this is, and it takes on different meanings every time it appears. This is a photogram just called Bread and Light from 1937. This is a graphic design that appeared in Illustration magazine in 1939. And there you see it being used for a completely different purpose. This is Bread in Hand from 1951, which Marton also had shown. And he discussed the inclusion of the bread, and in this case, had a much more politically charged meaning. And then this is a painting from 1981 called Bread Acrobats. And so the bread appears again, but now in a much more kind of playful way, as the title suggests, that they're maybe dancing, performing. Anyway, so that's an example of how one image can mean a lot of different things in his work. Anyway, another way that Kepes made his mark in our area was through public works and architectural works, which Marton already has discussed. But here is a stained glass that he did for the First Parish Unitarian Church in the Back Bay. And this, I believe, was in the 90s. Here's a stained glass that he did for the Trinity Episcopal Church in Concord much earlier. This was circa 1960, so more concurrent with the Davis painting, which was 1963. And I think you can see how, again, how his vocabulary transfers from medium to medium. It's actually a really beautiful piece. And then Martin showed this also. This is the glass mural at the Harvard Square bus terminal and Red Line station. I'm thrilled to learn that is being restored and will be lit again. If you go there right now, you probably wouldn't know it was there because it's dark, dark blue glass. It's more like a mirror. But anyway, these are all illustrations of how important and what a mark he has made in our area. I mean, there's the Wellesley Library was another great example, and he even did, in collaboration with his wife Juliet, he did murals for the Morse School in Cambridge, where my son actually attended. Small world. Kepes. Anybody who knew Kepes knew that he had a great sense of humor. Talking to him, he loved jokes, he loved making them, he loved hearing them. Plays on words, all of that were very much a part of his persona. And sometimes that translated into his paintings. This is called To Whom It May Concern, and it's from 1976. And obviously he's playing with abstraction and illusion. The orange form on the bottom is the shape of an envelope, but it's a flat shape, and the blue is sort of encroaching in on it, but then he has drawn an envelope at the top that looks like it's sort of floating up. It's a very playful piece. And this is also, playing on taking actual images from everyday life and incorporating them into his work. This is Latent Heart from 1986. So there was one time we were laying out an exhibition that we were installing of his work. And one of his paintings had been accidentally leaned up against the wall upside down. And he very politely corrected the mistake, but stopped and said, well, I mean, if you like it the other way better, fine. Hang it that way. And so we started playing around with things. And I mean, we hung it the way he had intended. But it was remarkable how his compositions are so balanced that whichever way you turned it, it kind of made sense. So I thought we would try it out with abstract composition. So here's the normal orientation. And then turn it 90 degrees. How does that look? Again. I mean, things obviously are shifting, but they still make sense. And then back to the beginning. You may try this at home. I just think that it's a testament to his sense of composition that you're even able to do that. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the sort of autobiographical aspect of his paintings. So in the 60s, I'm not sure the exact date, he contracted spinal meningitis, and it was a very serious illness, and the ramifications of which affected him for the rest of his life. As Julie mentioned, he spent many of his later years in a wheelchair, and it was all because of that. But that didn't stop him from referencing those issues in his work. This is Puzzle from 1972, and he has actually collaged into the painting an image. I think it's a spinal image, and I'm pretty sure it's his own spine that he's putting in there as a way of, I mean, he's saying something about himself and what he's been through, but at the same time, obviously his fascination with imaging is well known, and I think it's interesting how he's kind of talking about what can be seen and what can't be seen and how things can be seen. The relatively new technology of medical imaging was fascinating to him. Because again, thinking back to ciphers and hidden messages, this fascinated him because this was a way of seeing something that normally couldn't be seen. And this is Slumbering Truth from 1976. And again, this isn't collage, but he's incorporating a brain scan into his painting. And this is not him, but it's another example of his use of collage and his fascination with advances in imaging, and that's Metaphora from 1975. So I also was going to show you a sequence of photographs, one or two of which you have already seen. These were photographs that were taken by Bela Kalman in 1980. And I don't know, some of you might remember Life magazine doing the articles about painters and sort of documenting the process of making the painting. For Pollock paints a painting, for example. So this is sort of like Kepes paints a painting. So here he's in his studio, he's at his desk, and he's sketching, making a rough sketch of what he plans to do. Then with the canvas on the floor, he's mapping it out on the stretched and primed canvas. And then back on the easel. Now, he's already applied the sand, and I'm sure Theresa will talk more about this, but he applies adhesive to the canvas, then the sand, and then starts working with the paint. Back on the floor. Now he's sort of almost sort of splashing, spraying paint to create those kinds of cloudy, softer effects. Now, you saw this one back on the easel. This is at his studio. He had a studio at the Fenway Studios, which is a very historic building in Boston devoted to live workspaces for artists, which, you know, deserves its own historical study. Wonderful place. And now adding more color, refining the delineation of the sanded, painted areas. And here he's actually sort of moving the paint around on the canvas. It's almost like an action painting, just letting the paint flow and drip and you know, sort of, it's calculated, but there's also an element of chance involved, which is in contrast to, you know, the sort of geometry that he mapped out earlier in the process. And then just going into it more with layers of color, applied with the brush, sprayed, splattered, every way you can think of. Now, sometimes he would transport works in progress to his summer house in Wellfleet to continue working on them, which, as Marton said, you know, was a great source of inspiration for him. And here he is on the porch in Wellesley, putting the finishing touches on the painting with two of his young protégés, two of his grandchildren, both of whom went on to train as artists. So the legacy continues. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Joanna. That was fantastic. If I can get this back here. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So Theresa Carmichael received diplomas from the Conservation of Easel Paintings from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and the Center for Conservation and Technical Studies at Harvard. She is a member of the International Institute of Conservation, the American Institute for Conservation, and the New England Conservation Association. She's been in private practice for 30 years and is also the owner of Carmichael Art Conservation. So please join me in welcoming Theresa.
Thank you, Arthurina. And Lisa, I appreciate the privilege of being able to talk to you here today about the conservation of abstract composition, Kepes's painting here at the Davis. The conservation treatment of the Davis's Kepes painting was somewhat unusual, if not problematic. The technique and materials used were experimental, not those dictated in the treatises of artists' techniques over the centuries. It was experimental in the use of sand in the paint layer. It was experimental in the mix of casein with oil. And one needs to ask the question, are all paintings made to last for centuries like the old masters? As conservators, we usually regard such unstable and experimental materials as a challenge, if not a nightmare. We have seen more experimental and strange things added to paints than he was doing, and treating them is often a challenge. In the case of the Davis's painting, the paint layers were not analyzed chemically, nor were the paintings x-rayed. The analysis is based on observation of what is known about Kepes's materials and techniques. So I will break down the structure, the compositional structure of this picture, and go through the conservation step by step. So this is his picture in a raking light, and you can see it's very textured. The mosaic tiles are proud of the paint surface, and you can see the surface of the sand within the paint. So we'll start with the secondary support. That consists of a 4-membered miter cut stretcher, which is a commercial stretcher. It has wooden keys in the corners, which you generally tap out to increase the tension within the canvas itself. In this case, 2 of the keys are missing. I wanted to just point out in this picture that these are the black areas, large black areas, and you see they're much whiter than the rest, which is kind of interesting. And those would correspond to areas that, as Joanna mentioned, when he put down the glue, which he would put the sand on, the glue actually penetrated the canvas, leaving these sort of sealed areas which were not as affected by dirt and grime. The canvas support is a linen fabric that has been prepared with a white gesso ground, and you can see that around the outside here. The canvas was found to be structurally sound. The paint layer consists of a thin black oil wash, which is applied over the white priming overall. You can see that in between all the mosaic layers. Kepes then applied an opaque oil-based paint layer using a flat brush, making squares that mimic mosaic tiles and leaving some areas with amorphous black shapes. So you can see that when I spoke with Marton before this, he was under the impression that they actually might have been little tiles put on the piece, but that's not the case. They're actually paint. To the black shapes, he appears to have attached coarse sand. Now, in this case, it was more like aquarium sand, but it does vary in coarseness from one area to another. In some places, it looks like the sand, which may have been from the Wellfleet beaches, but in other places, it really does look more like aquarium sand. Casein paint, which is similar to gouache in its texture and opacity, is made from curdled milk with a resinous emulsifier, allowing it to be compatible with oil, the oil-based paint that he's previously used, even though it's aqueous in its nature when you apply it. He then seems to have used a casein wash, thicker in some areas and thinner in other areas. In some cases, it's sort of a transparent black in which he's applying it more to areas. They start very bright with little wash, and then they become more and more wash as it goes outward. They may have once been more transparent than they are now, or it may have been, the white in this area. At first, it was thought perhaps to be a glue or something that had discolored, but in point of fact, it appears to be a casein paint, and he's able to apply it very thinly in a glaze in some areas, and it becomes much thicker in other areas. And one might wonder if he was not trying to make the grout, as it were, between some of the mosaics in this area white as opposed to the dark that was elsewhere. Stress cracks have developed over time, particularly in the whitish casein layer throughout the composition. The painting was never varnished, and the surface had become quite covered with dust and grime. I'm going to show you some examples of the surface. So you can see the coarseness. You can also see many areas in which the sand has dropped off. In some areas you have parts of the mosaic tile sort of lifted as well. And here I think you can see that the glaze, the dark glaze that was intentional in some areas. So now I'm going to talk about the conservation treatment. The first step was to stabilize the flaking paint. Every effort was made to keep the painting as flat as possible prior to treatment, as the sand was particularly vulnerable. The paint was poorly bound and it was flaking where it was thickly applied. The cracked and flaking paint was stabilized using a polyvinyl acetate emulsion, which is applied using a small brush and hypodermic needles underneath the lifted and raised areas of paint. Next came the removal of surface dirt and grime. This was precarious due to the poorly bound paint and the fragility of the paint-covered sand. A damp swab soaked in a mild enzyme solution was carefully rolled over the surface, and the pointed tip was used to pick up grime between the grains of sand. A conscious effort was taken to maintain the balance of the delicate shading between the painted colored tiles. And the reverse of the painting was cleaned mechanically, and missing keys were replaced. And then the painting was very gently keyed out so as not to dislodge any more sand. I think this picture is after cleaning, but you can clearly see all of the areas of missing sand. Paint losses were filled using a mixture of chalk, gelatin, and polyvinyl acetate emulsion. And then the losses were in-painted using dry pigment ground in polyvinyl acetate resin. The in-painting medium was kept particularly lean so as to mimic the surrounding areas. The painting was not varnished. Although the conservation treatment of this painting was not overly extensive, it certainly was challenging. The treatment was carried out with respect to the artist's vision and the history of the painting and what it's endured. We aim to intervene as little as possible. We rarely go that far. There, that's before in painting. There's a large loss in the center of that picture. So we intervene as little as possible with respect to the artist's vision and the history of the painting and what's endured. We aim to preserve the painting for future generations without changing the integrity of the piece. So I leave you with this question. Was this painting meant to last for centuries, or an experiment with light, color, and texture causing a reaction of the viewer? Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. That was another fantastic presentation. We do have some time for Q&A. So at this time, I ask for Theresa and Joanna. We'll have them gather in the front. And I do also note that we have some members from the panel commission in Wellesley as well. So this would be a great time to have some time first for questions, and also thinking about the local relationship to Kepes's work as well. So I'm going to grab the microphone and we'll pass this around.
How many of those works are you conserving? How many shots do you?
I just did the one here that belongs to the Davis Museum, and once upon a time, about 28 years or so ago, I had another picture that was from a private owner on the vineyard, and it had a great deal of sand in it also, and the sand remained intact. There really weren't losses. Well, there were a few losses in the sand, but the biggest problem with that picture was mold. Of course, all the casing is very hygroscopic, also absorbing moisture from the atmosphere. And you know, when you get these things in the very humid Cape air or air in the islands, it tends to attract
attract mold. They're not really materials that would deter mold from growing on them. So, but that's been my experience. I have not worked with the pictures at the library, which are enamel and very different surface.
You mentioned varnish. Can you tell me about that? Is that used in the conservation process as well?
Usually if a painting comes in varnished, it's then varnished before it goes out. The varnish acts as a protective layer, and it also saturates usually the paint layers so that they have the depth that they were intended to have. Some pictures are never varnished, you know, at the beginning when the artist is finished. Usually a painting is varnished a year or more after it's been completed. These pictures were never intended to be varnished. You might ask yourself whether or not the varnish would help keep the sand intact, but it would just be a nightmare in terms of removing it. The philosophy of conservation today is that everything that we do is readily removable without harming the original. And a varnish in the case of a sandy painting would not be that.
Yeah, and I have an internal question. I mean, I don't have any idea how this varnish holds up over time. I would imagine that it has organic particles in it.
Yes, the most traditional varnishes that were used were a mastic or a damar varnish. They're both natural resins, and a mastic would discolor in 15 to 20 years and a damar in 25 to 30 years, making them completely yellowed in that time. Synthetic varnishes do not discolor in that way. They may gray just slightly over a long period of time, but they don't. But they're not intended to have adhesive properties particularly either. They become brittle a little bit. Yes?
Personal question.
Sure.
We have quite a few of my dad's things on the cake.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been there for years.
No mold?
So we have a number of paintings of my father's on Cape Cod, probably acquiring a great deal of mold, even though they're not indicating that directly. Do you have any advice, heaters, anything we should do?
Climate control.
Not an option.
Not an option. No, I know it usually isn't. I've been in houses on the Cape that, you know, they just had the sliding glass doors on either side open and watch the fog just roll through the house. And, you know, there's about a 1/4 inch thick layer of mold on the wall behind the paintings and in the paintings, you know, just through and through in the paintings. So that's rather scary.
It's not that bad.
No, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Mold would appear as little sort of white, almost like puffs, little tiny, not so much marshmallow-like things, but little white spots that go in circles, you know, in clusters, often in clusters around the painting.
You would see it on the front?
Usually on the front.
Or on the canvas side, because we're not seeing that at all on the...
You may just want to peek behind the painting and
okay.
see if you see spots on the back of the painting. And if you're really sensitive, you can go up to it and put your nose to it and smell it. If it smells musty, then you should be mold. And it can be, the good news is that it can be killed, even if you weren't to remove it. It can be killed using an alcohol solution. So we do that with a compressor. So at least you can kill it, not just make it dormant. If you were to dry out your atmosphere, you can make it dormant, but it may come back as soon as the moisture returns to the atmosphere.
Okay. Thank you.
I actually have a question for you. So when you showed the back of the painting and the areas where the thick black areas, the canvas was a different color, you attribute that to the glue, and do you know what kind of glue it was?
Well, I know that he used casein on the front of the picture, but casein can also be used as an adhesive. Whether that's what he was using or not, I'm not entirely sure. The casein on the front became somewhat brittle and cracked, but it wasn't clear what glue was underneath the paint, as it were, so I'm not sure. But I think those patches on the back indicate where the glue had gone through the canvas to the back, and that's not an uncommon thing to see.
Because I've actually also seen the opposite, where areas where the sand has been applied, it's actually darker than other areas of the canvas.
Well, that's what I mean, that it should be, because the glue has actually gone through the canvas, and those would be the areas that have the sand on them.
Yeah.
Yes?
Was there any consideration of replacing the lost sand?
Well, yes, we certainly considered it. In this case, we thought it less intrusive to put back dots of paint that matched the surrounding areas as opposed to putting back sand. Because the sand was painted, I'm not sure that I would have put back the exact same kind of sand that he used. And, you know, it's sort of a judgment call.
So you camouflaged?
Yes, we in-painted it without putting our own sand in and making it, we try not to make it our own, just make it less obtrusive, the losses.
All right, and we are actually, I wanted to introduce a couple of more people in the audience. So Sylvia Hahn with the Wellesley Kepes Panel Commission, and also a former student of Kepes, George Roman, as well. So we're going to take a moment, and if they would like to join us for the panel, it would create some really further dialogue about Kepes' work and the really wonderful reaches he has in the community. So we'll take several more questions. So let's.
Joanna, I have a painting which jury had apparently decided looked better. I have a painting that jury apparently decided looked better a different way than he'd written. So the title is written on the back, and then he's made a line to show that you need to hang it the other way around, and then the title was written again that way. So it's got the title twice facing each direction. Just saying that.
No, I've actually seen
maybe it was the painting that you had placed against the wall upside down.
Right. Yeah, could be. I have seen that more than once. With sometimes the title in one orientation, and then the signature in another, and then an arrow.
Yeah, the arrow.
Facing yet another.
Yeah.
Or an arrow that's then been crossed out.
Right.
And then written back in a different orientation.
Right.
So now I'd like to give the mic to Sylvia and George. If you could tell us about yourselves, a little bit more about the panel commission.
Sure. Good afternoon, and I'm thrilled that this symposium is happening regarding György Kepes. I am Hungarian, and I am on the György Kepes panel committee here in Wellesley. And I'm very honored to share a spot there with George Roman, who is a former student and a celebrated Wellesley architect. And Joel is also a gentleman in the audience, is also on our committee. And the Wellesley Kepes Panel Committee was created because the town of Wellesley owns over 65 gorgeous enamel pieces created by György Kepes. When Carl Koch, the architect who built the Wellesley Free Library, asked his friend György to help create a beautiful building, György did so and created these beautiful enamel panels. And they were the exterior. Marton showed a photograph of the building, and when the library was slated to be demolished, a gentleman by the name of Dante de Grutula went before the library committee to say, we need to save these panels. We can't let them go into demolition. And sure enough, the panels have been saved, and they've been sleeping in the basement of the Wellesley Hills Library basement, because they haven't found a home. So the Wellesley Kepes Panel Committee, we are stewards of those panels and hoping to find a home for them. Some of them were put onto the new Wellesley High School that was built a few years ago. Some of them were randomly chosen to adorn the new Wellesley Free Library without really any regard to how György would have liked to have had them. So they are, if you want to have a look at what the panels look like, one of the 72, I think, in total, you can go to the Wellesley Free Library. On the exterior of the building, you can see some of those panels. So as a group, we are hoping to find a home for these panels. They are stunning, beautiful. We have a new elementary school that is being built in Wellesley, the Honeywell School, which happens to be right beside the Wellesley Free Library. So it would make sense, and hopefully that architectural firm will consider these panels for that school, which would be a tremendous gift for an elementary school to have the amazing work of such a celebrated artist to be a part of their building, a part of their structure. So I will pass over to George, and maybe he has a few thoughts.
This is easy, yes. First, let me say a few words as to my experience with György Kepes as an impressionable fledgling architectural student. He impressed me from the first moment, and we talked about vocabulary of the painting itself, but he had an incredible vocabulary in the ability to articulate visual. You know, his book was The Language of Vision, which was what we all studied in school, or at least worked off of at the time. But he certainly had a language to describe that vision. He was extremely articulate, and I remember going away from the studio sometimes just thinking of the words and the way he expressed himself, which motivated students to perform hopefully good student works of art. The other thing I'll go back is, as Sylvia said, we have these panels, and we've been working to been preserving them for some years, and preserving in the sense that we keep them in storage and so forth, and are constantly looking for ways and places to display them, because right now they're basically out of view. And the other thing is that these panels and the whole building system, in a sense, was unique, in that, as Sylvia mentioned, he collaborated with Carl Koch, and these panels are unique in the sense that they actually form the building seals. They're not just applied works of art. The panels are constructed as such that they're insulated, they're integrated into the window system. They are part of the window system, in fact, so they actually form the building seal and the insulation of the building itself. So in that respect, that's quite unique. Thank you.
What are the panels made out of?
They're porcelainized. They're metal panels, steel, very, very thin, very heavy. And he worked on them in a shop that I believe had to do with things that baked. He found a shop. It was an automobile shop. They had to do the baked enamel, and you saw him working on them. You had some pictures of them. And then they were put into ovens in various stages of the applique. And it was baked on, and they're quite durable, and they held up quite well. They need to be cleaned to some extent, but given their history that they've been outside and exposed to the New England elements, you know, since the 50s, and now stored in a basement, they're really in pretty good shape.
Yeah, do we have any other questions? All right. Well, our speakers and George and Sylvia will be around, so I encourage you to head upstairs to see abstract composition in person on the 5th floor, and then I encourage you to have a bite to eat. We'll have a reception, but please feel free to reach out to your speakers and George and Sylvia. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our Davis Discoveries focusing on Kepes, and I'm so glad that Julie was also able to join us today. So let's give a round of applause to all of our